people spend an entire summer babying a 25-foot row of potatoes and walk away with maybe 30 pounds at the end of it all. My family grew up to 100 pounds of potatoes in a space so small you could lay a single sheet of plywood over it and cover the whole thing. I am not exaggerating. I grew up doing this. I grew up watching my mother and grandmother do this. And before you scroll past thinking this is some kind of gardening clickbait, let me tell you something. The people who taught me this never once bought a bag of fertilizer. They never turned on a sprinkler system. They never ordered anything off the internet. They used what the land gave them, what the animals gave them, and what their grandparents taught them. And somehow, in a 4-foot by 4-foot patch of ground, they grew enough potatoes to feed a family through an entire Pennsylvania winter. My name is Sarah. I am 24 years old. I grew up in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, inside an old order Amish community. I left when I was 19. That is a whole other story for another time. But one thing I took with me when I walked out of that life was every single thing I learned about growing food from almost nothing. And today, I want to share with you the potato method that blew my mind as a little girl and still honestly blows my mind today as someone living in the modern world. Because when you understand how this works, you are going to look at your backyard, your balcony, even a corner of your driveway completely differently. Growing up, we did not have the luxury of spreading potatoes out across acres of land the way commercial farms do. The average Amish family farm in Lancaster County is around 40 acres. That sounds like a lot until you realize the average American farm is over 440 acres, and the Amish are feeding entire families and communities off that comparatively small piece of land, without tractors, without chemical fertilizers, without irrigation systems. Every single square foot of that land had a job to do. Nothing was wasted, nothing was an accident, and potatoes of all things were treated like gold. Because in the winter, when the garden was frozen solid and the fields were bare, potatoes were what kept you going. So here is what most people do wrong with potatoes before they even put a single one in the ground. They treat soil like it is just dirt. They dig a trench, they drop in their potatoes, they throw some store-bought soil or a bag of fertilizer over them, and they hope for the best. That is not how I was raised to do it. Before one seed potato ever touched the ground, we spent weeks preparing the soil, and I mean really preparing it. In late fall, right after the harvest, my dad and my older brothers would spread composted horse and cow manure across the garden beds. We had horses for working the fields and cows for milk. The manure from those animals would sit in a big pile near the barn for months, sometimes most of the winter, breaking down and turning into something that looked and smelled like dark, rich earth. By the time spring came, that composted manure was not harsh or sharp smelling anymore. It was just this deep, almost chocolatey looking soil amendment that you worked right into your growing bed. This alone completely changes what your soil is capable of. Here is something people who have never grown up on a working farm do not think about. Fresh manure will actually burn your plants. The nitrogen content is too high when it is raw, but aged, composted manure is a completely different animal. Literally, it releases nutrients slowly, it feeds the beneficial microbes in the soil, and it loosens up clay-heavy ground into something a potato root can actually push through. Lancaster County already has some of the most fertile soil in the entire country, and the reason is generations of farmers doing exactly this, building the soil up year after year instead of depleting it with synthetic chemicals. We also added wood ash. Now this is something almost nobody outside of an Amish or very old-fashioned farming community thinks to do, but it is one of the most powerful things you can give a potato. We heated our home with a wood stove all winter long. Every few days, my mother would scoop the ash out and save it in a dry metal container in the barn. Come spring, before planting, that ash went into the potato beds. Wood ash is loaded with potassium and calcium, two nutrients that are absolutely critical for potato development. Potassium is what helps the plant build those big, starchy tubers underground. Calcium strengthens cell walls and helps the plant resist disease. You are essentially giving your soil everything it needs without spending a single dollar. The wood ash was a byproduct of just staying warm in winter. In a community where nothing goes to waste, it got put back into the ground. Now here is where the method gets really interesting and where it separates from anything most people have ever been taught about growing potatoes. We did not grow potatoes flat, we grew them vertically. Let me explain what that means. Most home gardeners plant their seed potatoes in a shallow hole or trench, maybe 6 inches deep, and then they let the plant grow up out of the ground. The potato forms in that little underground zone around where the seed potato was placed. You get one layer of production, and at the end of the season, you dig it all up, and that is what you have. Maybe 10 to 15 pounds per plant if you are lucky. The Amish method flips this completely on its head by understanding one crucial thing about how potatoes actually grow. Potatoes do not just form beneath the seed potato, they form anywhere along the underground stem of the plant. And that means the more underground stem you create, the more potatoes you grow. It is that simple. And building a tower or a box structure that is just 4 feet by 4 feet at its base is how you create that underground growing space going upward instead of outward. Here is how my grandmother built her potato structure, and I want you to picture this because it is genuinely humble and beautiful in how simple it is. She took old wooden boards, or sometimes she used a cylinder of wire fencing bent into a circle, and she built herself a frame that was about 2 feet wide and 2 feet deep, sitting right on the ground. That is your 4 square feet. She lined the inside walls with bundled straw, thick enough to hold the soil in, but loose enough that the roots could breathe. Then she added about 6 inches of that composted manure and soil mixture to the bottom. She laid her seed potatoes on top of that first layer of soil, spacing them about 8 to 10 inches apart from each other.
Looks fine.
Now, the seed potatoes themselves were not just random potatoes pulled from the kitchen. This is another thing that matters enormously. The Amish saved their own seed potatoes every single year from the previous harvest. They were looking for late season varieties, not early ones. This is actually really important and a mistake a lot of beginners make. Early varieties, like Yukon Gold for example, they set their fruit once near the bottom and they are done. They do not produce tubers up along the stem the way late season varieties do. So if you try this method with an early variety, you are going to be disappointed. You want a late season potato. In Pennsylvania, we grew varieties that are still commonly available today, like Kennebec, which is a really classic all-purpose potato, or Katahdin, which does well in the Northeast. These varieties keep producing tubers along the stem as you build up the layers. But before those seed potatoes went into the ground, we let them wake up first. About 3 to 4 weeks before planting time, usually around mid-April in Lancaster County, when the soil starts warming up but the hard frosts are mostly behind you, we would take our saved seed potatoes out of the root cellar and put them in a cool, bright spot inside the house. Not in sunlight, just in a bright, airy room. What happens is, the eyes of the potato, those little indentations you always see on the surface, they start to sprout. Short, stubby, strong little sprouts about 1/2 inch long. This process is called chitting, and farmers have been doing it for centuries. It tells the potato that growing season is here, and it gets a head start the moment it hits the soil. Plants grown from chitted potatoes emerge faster and stronger than those planted dormant. When the seed pieces are cut, which you do with a clean, sharp knife a couple days before planting, so the cut surface has time to dry and callus over and protect against rot, you make sure every piece has at least 2 or 3 of those eyes on it. Those eyes are your growing points. No eyes, no potatoes. So now you have your structure built, your soil and compost layer is in place, and your chitted seed potato pieces go down into that first layer. Then you cover them with another 5 or 6 inches of your soil and compost mixture. And now comes the patience part. You water the structure well, and you wait. After about 2 weeks, you are going to see green vines pushing up through the soil. You let those vines grow. You do not touch them. You let them climb until they are about 10 to 12 inches tall above the surface of the soil. And when they reach that height, you do something that goes against every instinct a new gardener has. You bury them. You add another layer of soil and compost and straw mixture right up over those vines, covering all but the top 3 or 4 inches of green growth. You essentially give the plant more underground stem to work with. What is happening below the surface right now is extraordinary. Every inch of that buried stem is putting out new little roots and new potato formation sites. The plant thinks it is getting deeper and deeper into the earth, and it responds by setting more and more tubers all along that buried stem. Each time you do this, you are adding another floor to your underground potato apartment building. My grandmother used to add 4 or 5 of these layers over the course of the season, building the structure up to 3 or sometimes 4 feet tall on a 2-foot base. Now, the straw on the outside of the structure is not just decorative. This is something I want to be really clear about because it does a lot of important work. First, it insulates. Pennsylvania summers can get hot, and potato tubers are sensitive to heat. When the soil around them gets too warm, potato production slows down and sometimes stops. The thick straw wall keeps the root zone cooler and more consistent. Second, straw retains moisture. In a community where you are not turning on a garden hose at will, water conservation matters deeply. We collected rainwater in barrels set under the roof gutters of the barn and the house, and that was what watered the garden. Every drop counted, and the straw mulch cut down on evaporation dramatically. And third, straw suppresses weeds. In a 4 square foot growing space, weeding is barely a concern when the straw is packed in thick around the structure. This alone saves hours of work over a growing season. Watering for potatoes grown this way needs to be deep and consistent. Shallow watering just wets the surface and does nothing for the tubers forming several inches below. When we watered slowly and thoroughly, letting it soak all the way down through every layer. A soaker situation or a slow, deliberate watering by hand about 2 or 3 times a week during dry stretches is what this method needs. The straw helps you need to water less often, but when you do water, make it count. One thing my mother watched for obsessively throughout the growing season was making sure no potatoes were peeking out above the soil surface. This sounds minor, but it is actually critical. Potatoes that get exposed to sunlight turn green. That green color is not just cosmetic. It is a compound called solanine, and it is mildly toxic. You cannot eat green potatoes. So anytime a tuber pushed up close to the surface and you could see it starting to show, you added more soil over it immediately. This is part of why the layering method works so well. You are constantly adding new soil on top, which naturally keeps everything buried and protected. Throughout the growing season, there were no trips to a garden center, no bags of fertilizer brought home. If the plants looked like they needed a little extra boost, which you could tell by the color of the leaves, lighter green or slightly yellowish, meant the nitrogen was running low, we simply added a top dressing of fresh compost from the pile near the barn. It sounds almost too simple, but it worked every time. The other thing my family did that I have never seen taught in modern gardening is they paid attention to what was growing near the potatoes. Companion planting was not a trend for us. It was just how you grew food. Marigolds were planted in borders around the garden and around the potato structure. They repel certain insects naturally. Beans were sometimes grown in an adjacent bed because they fix nitrogen in the soil, which benefits everything around them. Horseradish was always planted at the corners of the potato patch by my grandmother, and she swore it kept the Colorado potato beetle away. I cannot give you a scientific paper on that, but I can tell you that in all the years I watched her garden, we rarely had a serious pest problem on the potatoes. Now the moment everyone is waiting for, harvest. You know it is time when the potato vines start to die back on their own. The green leaves turn yellow and brown, and the whole plant starts to look tired. This is not a problem. This is the signal. The plant has put everything it had into building those tubers underground, and it is essentially shutting down for the season. In Lancaster County, this usually happens in late August through September, depending on the variety you planted. With a box structure made of boards, you start from the bottom and remove the lower boards or panels one by one, reaching in and pulling out the potatoes that have formed in the lowest layers. Those are your biggest ones usually. With a wire cage, you simply tip the whole thing over and work your way through the straw and soil by hand. What comes out of that 4 square foot base is staggering the first time you see it. You are pulling out potatoes from every layer all the way up the height of that structure. Small ones, medium ones, big, beautiful, round ones. A good year with good seed and proper layering can genuinely produce 80 to over 100 pounds from that little footprint. And after the harvest, none of that straw and compost goes to waste. It gets turned back into the soil or added to the compost pile, where it will break down over the winter and be ready to go back into the next year's potato bed. The whole system feeds itself. The potatoes we did not eat fresh were stored in the root cellar, a cool, dark underground room beneath the house that stays between 35 and 40 degrees Fahrenheit through the winter. They were laid out in single layers on wooden shelves, not touching each other, so if one started to rot, it would not spread to the others. Properly stored, those potatoes lasted from harvest in September all the way through to the following April, sometimes even longer. I know a lot of you watching this have small yards or no yard at all. I know some of you are in apartments or in neighborhoods where you just do not have the kind of space to run a real garden. And I want to tell you something directly from someone who grew up watching people feed a family of 8 on 40 acres without a single trip to the grocery store for vegetables. Space is almost never the limiting factor. Knowledge is. What you do with 4 square feet of ground when you actually understand the biology of what you are growing is enough to change the way your family eats for an entire season. You can build this structure in a backyard, on a patio, even on a rooftop with the right setup. You do not need perfect soil to start because you are building your own soil mix in layers. You do not need fancy tools, a shovel, a wire cage, or some old boards, straw from a local farm, and compost that you either make yourself or buy one single bag of. That is the total investment. My grandmother grew food this way her entire life and never once thought of it as something impressive or special. It was just Tuesday. It was just what you did when you had a family to feed and a piece of ground to work with. But watching her hands pull those potatoes out of that straw tower every September, armful after armful after armful, that was one of the most impressive things I have ever seen in my life. And I genuinely believe that if more people understood this method, if more people brought this kind of thinking back into their own growing practices, they would feel a kind of self-sufficiency and quiet confidence that is really hard to find in the modern world. Give it a try this growing season. Start small if you want, one structure, 4 square feet. Use the right late season variety. Build your soil with real organic matter. Layer as the vines grow. Keep the tubers covered from the light. Water deeply and consistently. Be patient, and then when September comes and you tip that tower over and you see what is waiting for you in that straw, you come back and tell me about it, because I already know what you are going to say.